Few words have proved as effective at neutering the Western man as racist. It works because it strikes at his self-conception. The Westerner sees himself as a moral and rational creature. To suggest that his instinctive preference for his own kind is both immoral and irrational is to brand him a hypocrite to his own ideals. As a result, the possibility of being labelled racist can deter even the mildest expression of in-group affinity or legitimate concerns about cultural change. The term has become a blunt instrument to police discourse and behaviour, stifling honest discussion with the threat of social and professional ruin. The immediate reflex is to highlight the glaring double standards surrounding ethnic pride and solidarity. In today's climate, every other group may openly celebrate its heritage and openly act in its group's interest, often lauded as healthy diversity or representation, yet Europeans are expected to denounce any comparable in-group preference as hateful or evil. This hypocrisy is indeed real and resented. However, hypocrisy, though worth noting, is not the most dangerous aspect of this situation. The truly perilous lie in Western discourse is the notion that any form of in-group preference is inherently irrational or pathological. This lie was not always a tenet of Western thought. Far from it. In the 19th century, most intellectuals understood human difference not as a problem to be erased, but as an inescapable reality. These distinctions were not pathological or shameful, they were simply a part of nature, a feature of human existence that had shaped civilization for millennia. The preference for one's own kin was a basic survival mechanism, a way of ensuring the continuity and health of one's lineage. It was prudent, rational, and above all, natural. It was only after the cataclysm of the Second World War that the Western world underwent a radical ideological shift. The horrors of the Second World War, the spectre of racial totalitarianism, and the widespread devastation of the war left a deep scar on the Western psyche. In the aftermath, the intellectual and political elites of the West sought to construct a new moral framework, one that rejected the racial distinctions that had, in their view, led to such a monstrous violence. The blank slate theory emerged as the central dogma of this new intellectual order. Under the new blank slate orthodoxy, social scientists taught that humans are almost infinitely malleable. Cultures and upbringing, they argued, explain all behavioural outcomes. Therefore, it was asserted if you drop a Chinese baby into an English family or an African baby into a Swedish family and vice versa, they will grow up indistinguishable from a native-born Briton or Swede. This view implied that group loyalties too were just artifacts of conditioning that enlightened governance could erase. With this paradigm in place, Western elites embarked on a radical social experiment never before attempted in history, the deliberate large-scale demographic transformation of their own nations under the banner of diversity, inclusion, and economic prosperity. Immigration policies were overhauled in the 1960s and beyond to enable mass immigration from non-European societies into Western Europe, North America, and Australia. The assumption was that people are people, that regardless of origin, newcomers were equally able to assimilate into the host society, becoming Americans or Germans or British, just like the natives after a generation or two. The nation-state, once conceived as an extended kinship community with a common culture, was reconceived as essentially a marketplace of individual choice. In this new vision, a nation was little more than a set of governing principles and economic opportunities. Under the benevolent gaze of liberal democracy, any collection of individuals from anywhere in the world could supposedly form a harmonious society, so long as the right laws and values like tolerance and equality were instilled. This propositional nation concept, the idea that a country is defined only by abstract ideals rather than any ethnic or historical character, became especially strong in countries like the United States. But even in Europe, leaders came to insist that Britain isn't about being British, it's about fairness. France is a set of Republican principles, not a French people. As US Vice President J.D. Vance put it recently, mocking this mindset, you cannot swap 10 million people from anywhere in the world and expect your country to remain unchanged. Our citizens are not interchangeable cogs in the global economy. yet the architects of the new multicultural order acted as if people were interchangeable. In their eyes, an influx of millions of migrants from, say, rural Pakistan or sub-Saharan Africa into Europe was just a colourful enrichment, a trivial cosmetic change rather than something that could fundamentally alter social trust, cultural norms, or political dynamics. Any concern to the contrary was dismissed as racist delusion. It is hard to overstate how unprecedented this project was. Until the mid-20th century, no civilization had ever tried to voluntarily remake itself into a multi-ethnic melting pot while expecting social harmony to persist. Certainly, empires like Rome or the Ottomans ruled over diverse peoples, but within their cores, there usually was a dominant group and a clear hierarchy. The kind of mass immigration undertaken by Western democracies in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, in which every Western land opened itself to essentially the entire world in the span of a few decades, had no real historical precedent. As author Douglas Murray observed, what had been Europe, the homeland of the European peoples, gradually became a home for the entire world. Neighbourhoods and towns that for centuries had one ethnic character rapidly became mosaics of global diasporas. For a while, many Europeans pretended this was completely normal, insisting that integration was just a matter of time and goodwill. If the first generation of immigrants didn't assimilate fully, surely their children or grandchildren would. If not, perhaps it didn't matter because diversity is our strength. Western leaders assured the public that with enough civic nationalism and liberal values, any mix of people could live together as one happy nation. Unfortunately, this optimistic creed ignored a simple reality. Deep cultural differences exist and not all groups assimilate equally well. As conservative writer Pat Buchanan bluntly warned, it is not true that all creeds and cultures are equally assimilable. In a first world nation born of England, Christianity, and Western civilization, race, faith, ethnicity, and history leave genetic fingerprints no propositional nation can erase. In other words, a nation is more than just a set of laws or ideals. It is also a people with a unique heritage and social fabric that newcomers may or may not mesh with. Western elites of the blank slate school vastly underestimated the challenge of integrating large numbers of people with very different languages, religions, and cultural norms. They assumed everyone would eventually adopt Western liberal individualism, but as Buchanan notes, a society built only on process neutralism, the idea that citizenship is just a paperwork status and culture is irrelevant, is a society unmoored from reality. Human beings do not assimilate into abstractions, they assimilate, if at all, into concrete communities with particular practices. Beyond electoral politics, there are other flashing warning signs. Advocates of the post-1960s experiment promised it would bring thriving cosmopolitan societies. But many Western nations instead see declining material prosperity, rising inequality, and fraying social bonds, while multiple factors contribute to economic stagnation, from deindustrialization to debt. One often ignored factor in social decline is the loss of social capital, the mutual trust and solidarity among citizens that enable a society to function smoothly. Decades ago, political scientist Robert Putnam, famous for bowling alone, conducted one of the largest studies on diversity and social trust. Putnam surveyed 30,000 Americans and found a sobering pattern. In ethnically diverse communities, people tend to hunker down, withdrawing from collective life and not trusting their neighbours. Strikingly, this decrease in trust was not just between different ethnic groups. Even people who lived in diverse areas distrusted those who looked like themselves more than people in homogeneous areas did. Diversity, in the short run at least, acted like a social solvent, loosening the bonds of community. Residents of more homogeneous towns, for example rural North or South Dakota, which are overwhelmingly white, reported far higher trust levels in local others and stronger civic engagement than residents of highly diverse cities like Los Angeles. Putnam's data showed that in relatively homogeneous American communities, such as Dakota, 70 to 80% of people said they trust their neighbors a lot, whereas in highly diverse areas like Los Angeles or San Francisco, only 30% said the same. People living in more diverse neighborhoods had fewer close friends, reported being less happy and having a lowered perceived quality of life, and were less likely to give charity or volunteer in their community. Ethnically mixed areas saw low participation in democratic processes, fewer people bothering to register to vote, and reduced confidence in local institutions like government and media. In essence, diversity correlated with civic disengagement and anxiety. These findings have been dubbed the downside of diversity. Although many academics initially hoped increased diversity would automatically foster broader tolerance, the reality is much more complex. Putman himself, a liberal scholar, believed that in the long run societies could find ways to bridge differences, citing examples of past immigrant groups eventually assimilating. But he admitted that in the short term to medium term, the effect of rapid demographic change has people psychologically pulling in like a turtle. What do these dry statistics mean in practice? They mean Western societies are becoming less livable and more contentious as they become more diverse. It is not a coincidence that many Western cities have seen parallel rises in tribalism and segregation. When people don't feel a basic social trust or shared identity with their neighbours, they often retreat into micro-communities of their own kind. Self-segregation can occur even without legal mandates. We see ethnic enclaves solidifying, parallel societies where each group watches its own TV shows, uses their own language, trusts their own leadership. Meanwhile, national level politics become a zero-sum game tussle between identity groups, each seeking their share of power and resources. In democratic countries, voting is increasingly predictable by ethnic or religious lines, e.g. a strong majority of Group A votes for Party X while Group B votes for Party Y, undermining the ideal of issue-based or principle-based politics. This Bulcanization of society was not supposed to happen under the liberal integrationist vision, yet it is happening precisely because the vision misjudged human nature. History offers a clear warning about what can happen when latent ethnic or sectarian tensions are ignored or forcefully suppressed. Eventually they erupt. In the past, such tensions tended to erupt between nations on battlefields in wars between peoples. Today, by importing myriad foreign populations into Western states, we have transplanted those potential conflicts inside our own countries. The consequences could be dire. One often cited example is Yugoslavia, a multi-ethnic country that was held together for decades under an authoritarian communist ideology that preached brotherhood and unity while forbidding the expression of ethnic nationalism. For a time, it seemed to work. Yugoslavia was relatively stable and peaceful under Marshal Tito's rule. But as soon as that top-down pressure relaxed in the 1990s, the suppressed identities resurfaced with a vengeance, resulting in Yugoslav Federation disintegrating in a series of brutal ethnic wars. Serbians, Croatians, and Bosnians and others breaking into hostile camps defined by blood and faith. A scholarly analysis of that conflict notes, the communist regime suppressed the various ethnic identities of groups and tried to create a supra-ethnic Yugoslav one. Yet this suppression proved costly indeed, for when those identities were permitted expression, they took shape in ferocious forms. In short, the attempt to deny people's deep-rooted affiliations do not eliminate those affiliations. It only bottled them up until that bottle exploded. Western countries in the early 20th century are of course not Yugoslavia circa 1990. We still have democratic institutions and in most places the rule of law, but the basic dynamic of suppressed tensions hold. We are playing a dangerous game by pretending that human tribal nature has been transcended by our progressive values. If anything, by tabooing frank discussions of ethnic frictions through charges of racism, Western elites ensure that grievances fester unresolved. Problems related to immigration or integration are swept under the rug, or critical voices silenced. Yet the pressure behind the rug keeps building. History suggests that this ends badly if not corrected. When a society's ruling ideology clashes this starkly with human nature, eventually reality strikes back. And when it does, it tends not to be polite academic debate that ensues, but rather anger, disorder, or even violence. We already see early symptoms: ethnic riots in some European cities, resurgent nationalist movements, communal tensions over issues like crime or schooling. These are canaries in the coal mine. They hint that the much celebrated, diverse and multicultural future may actually be a future of parallel communities in perpetual mutual mistrust or worse, open conflict. It is sobering to realize that the past generations of Western statesmen and intellectuals would likely be aghast at our leaders' willful blindness. Even relatively liberal voices a few decades ago understood that social cohesion is fragile. For instance, former Singaporean leader Lee Kuan Yew once remarked that increasing diversity in Western countries would create deep problems, saying, "I've seen what happens in Sri Lanka and Malaysia, where multiculturalism failed and led to conflict." He implied that Westerners were naive to think they were immune to such forces. Likewise, as mentioned, thinkers like Buchanan warned that combining mass immigration with multiculturalist ideology, which celebrates persistent differences, is essentially a nation destroyer. These warnings, often shouted down as bigotry at the time, ring increasingly true as events unfold. The liberal faith in human interchangeability, the idea that we can completely remold society without regard to inherited human instincts or historical identities, is not noble enlightenment. It is reckless utopianism masquerading as moral law, telling people that caring about their own demographic continuity is evil may shame them into silence for a while, but it cannot erase their true feelings forever. A civilization can ignore the fundamentals of its own nature for years, perhaps even for a prosperous half-century, but not indefinitely. Eventually, the truth of human nature reasserts itself, and when it does, the correction tends to be sudden and severe, not gentle. As one commenter on this trend noted, clinging to the happy myth about diversity while suppressing all dissent is akin to handcuffing ourselves to the railroad tracks with a coming train. In our context, the train is an inevitable reckoning with demographic and social reality. In summary, in-group preference is a natural human trait, not inherently immoral or irrational. Western nations, in a fit of post-war idealism, attempted to rewrite human nature by denying this reality and transforming their societies in ways no civilization tried before. The experiment is faltering, trust is falling, polarization is rising, and suppressed tensions are mounting. A frank reassessment is needed. It is not racist to recognize that successful societies require some degree of cohesion, trust, and common identity. In fact, it may be the only way to save the West from an ominous future that our leaders, blinded by dogma, have thus far refused to see.